You seem remarkably pleased with yourself, Arthur.
Why shouldn't I be? One signature and I'm finally free of you.
He threw the quill onto the mahogany desk, his cruel laughter echoing through the library as her signature dried on the divorce decree. He thought he was finally rid of his penniless, unwanted bride. He didn't know the king was waiting, holding a secret that would destroy the Duke's entire bloodline. The rain in London that autumn of 1814 seemed to fall exclusively on the grand, imposing roof of the Westmorland townhouse in Mayfair. Inside, however, the fires roared, reflecting off gold leaf mirrors and crystal chandeliers. Lady Genevieve Sinclair had been the Duchess of Westmorland for 3 agonizing years, though she rarely felt like more than a ghost haunting her own halls. Her marriage to Arthur Hallowell, the extraordinarily wealthy and deeply arrogant Duke of Westmorland, had been a transaction brokered in the desperate, waning days of her father's life. The Earl of Sinclair had died drowning in debt, and Arthur had paid those debts in exchange for Genevieve's hand. Why Arthur had agreed to marry a woman with no dowry and a crumbling ancestral estate in the Scottish borders was a question that had plagued Mayfair society for years. The whispers at Almack's and the sneers in the Times Morning Post Times suggested it was merely a power play, a way for the newly minted Duke to show the ton that he could buy an ancient, aristocratic bloodline as easily as he bought his prize-winning thoroughbreds. Genevieve stood by the towering drawing-room window, watching the carriages roll through the rain. She wore a simple gown of deep navy silk, stripped of the ostentatious jewels Arthur usually forced her to wear. She was a striking woman, possessing the dark, stormy eyes of the Scottish Sinclairs, and a quiet, unyielding grace that infuriated her husband. "You are staring at the glass again, Genevieve. It is incredibly tedious," a voice drawled from the doorway. Arthur stepped into the room. He was classically handsome, with sharp cheekbones, fair hair meticulously styled, and a sneer that never quite left his lips. He was dressed flawlessly, smelling of expensive brandy and the heavy, sweet rose perfume of his longtime mistress, Lady Beatrice Linley. Genevieve did not turn around. "I was merely observing the weather, Your Grace. It seems fitting for the day." Arthur crossed the room, the heels of his polished boots clicking against the parquet floor. "Let us drop the miserable wife routine, shall we? You knew what this arrangement was the day you walked down the aisle at St. George's, Hanover Square. You received your father's cleared ledgers. I received a broodmare with an impeccable pedigree. Unfortunately, you have failed at your singular task." The words struck like a physical blow, though Genevieve kept her spine rigid. 3 years, and she had provided no heir. The physicians had whispered that the fault might lie with Arthur, but in Regency society, the blame always fell heavily and solely upon the woman's shoulders. "And Beatrice?" Genevieve asked softly, finally turning to face him. "Has she succeeded where I have failed?" Arthur's eyes flashed with a dangerous, cold light. Beatrice Linley was the widow of a minor baron, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ruthless ambition. Arthur paraded her through Hyde Park in an open carriage, seated her in his private box at the Royal Opera House, and practically installed her in the Westmorland country estate. "Beatrice is none of your concern," Arthur snapped. "But since you bring her up, yes, she is currently residing in the East Wing, resting. She is carrying my child." Genevieve felt the breath leave her lungs. The sheer audacity of bringing his pregnant mistress into their London home was a social scandal so immense that even Arthur's vast wealth might not shield him from the fallout. But Arthur didn't care about society's rules. He believed his family's money wrote them. "You have brought her here," Genevieve said, her voice eerily calm, despite the trembling of her hands. "I have," Arthur replied, walking over to a crystal decanter and pouring himself a drink. "And I require this house to be suitably prepared for the mother of the future Duke of Westmorland. Which brings me to the matter at hand. We are dissolving this farce of a marriage, Genevieve." "A divorce?" The word tasted foreign, sharp, and bitter. In this era, divorces required an act of parliament. They were messy, scandalous, and ruined the woman irreparably. An annulment, actually, Arthur corrected, taking a sip of his brandy and smiling wickedly. My solicitors, Mr. Josiah Abernathy and Mr. Henry Fitzroy, have discovered a rather fascinating loophole regarding the terms of your father's debts and the consummation of our vows. I have witnesses, servants you thought loyal, who will swear under oath that we have lived entirely separate lives. A parliamentary divorce takes too long. The ecclesiastical courts will grant the annulment, declaring this marriage null and void from the beginning. Genevieve stared at him, realizing the depth of his cruelty. You will cast me out with nothing. If the marriage is annulled, I am not a duchess, nor a widow. I am a ruined spinster. My family's debts will fall back onto my name. Precisely, Arthur laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You will leave with the clothes on your back. You can return to that crumbling pile of rocks your family calls a castle in Scotland. Beatrice will be the new duchess by Christmas. Have your maid pack your trunks. Abernathy will be here at 3 o'clock with the papers. The library of the Westmorland estate was a room designed to intimidate. The walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes, and the ceiling was painted with a sweeping fresco of Greek gods casting judgment upon mortals. At exactly 3 o'clock, Genevieve walked into the room. She had not cried. She had shed all her tears for Arthur Hallowell in the first 6 months of their marriage. Now, there was only a cold, burning resolve settling in the pit of her stomach. Arthur sat behind his massive mahogany desk, looking like a king upon a throne. To his right stood Mr. Abernathy, a thin, rat-faced solicitor with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. To his left was Mr. Fitzroy, a younger, eager man holding a stack of heavy parchment documents tied with red ribbon, and lounging on a velvet chaise by the fireplace, utterly unbothered by the impropriety of her presence, was Lady Beatrice Linley. She was dressed in a spectacular gown of emerald silk, idly fanning herself while watching Genevieve's arrival with a look of triumphant malice. Ah, Genevieve, Arthur said, waving a hand lazily. Do come in. Let us make this swift. The carriage is waiting in the rain to take you to wherever it is you belong. Your Grace, Genevieve said, keeping her chin high. She did not acknowledge Beatrice. She walked directly to the desk. Are you truly intent on doing this? You know the scandal it will cause. Lord Liverpool himself will hear of it. Ah. Let the Prime Minister gossip like a scullery maid, I do not care, Arthur sneered. The Westmorland fortune is untouchable. My family practically built this city. We own the docks, the shipping routes, the coal mines. The Crown needs my taxes more than it cares about your ruined reputation. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat and pushed the parchment forward. Lady Genevieve, if you would just sign here, at the bottom. By doing so, you acknowledge that the marriage was never validly consummated, and you forfeit any and all claims to the Westmorland titles, estates, dowers, and personal properties. Genevieve looked down at the heavy black ink. She thought of her father, of the Sinclair name. It had been an ancient, proud name, long before the Hallowells had made their fortune in trade and bought their way into the peerage. If I refuse? She asked. Arthur leaned forward, his handsome face contorting into something ugly. If you refuse, I will freeze your accounts. I will throw your remaining elderly aunts out of the Sinclair cottage. I will drag your name through the mud in the Times Morning Post Times until you are pelted with rotting fruit in the streets. Sign the damn paper, Genevieve. Beatrice let out a soft, silvery giggle from the chaise. Do hurry, darling. The smell of wet wool from her dress is giving me a headache. Genevieve picked up the quill. The feather felt impossibly heavy in her fingers. She looked at Arthur, the man who had stripped her of her dignity, her family home, and her youth. She dipped the quill into the inkwell. With slow, deliberate strokes, she wrote her name, Genevieve Sinclair. Not Hallowell, Sinclair. As she lifted the pen, the ink gleaming wetly in the firelight, Arthur burst into laughter. It was a loud, victorious, booming sound that echoed off the painted ceilings. "Excellent!" Arthur clapped his hands together, his laughter subsiding into a wide, cruel grin. "Abernathy, take that straight to the courts. Fitzroy, show the former Duchess to the servants' door. We wouldn't want her dirtying the front steps on her way out." Genevieve turned without a word. She did not run, nor did she bow her head. She walked with the posture of a queen walking to the guillotine. The rain was coming down in sheets when she stepped out into the cobblestone alleyway behind the Mayfair mansion. True to his word, Arthur had provided no carriage for her. She had a single, worn valise clutched in her hand, containing 3 plain dresses and a miniature portrait of her mother. The servants, people she had known and cared for over 3 years, stood in the windows watching her go, forbidden by the Duke to offer an umbrella or a kind word. She walked into the rain, her velvet cloak quickly becoming heavy and soaked, the cold biting through to her bones. She was discarded. She was nothing. Or so the Duke of Westmorland believed. Genevieve found lodging in a dismal, drafty boarding house near Covent Garden, a stark contrast to the sprawling grandeur of Mayfair. For 2 days, she survived on weak tea and stale bread, nursing a fever caught from her walk in the freezing rain, and trying to formulate a plan to survive the ruin of her life. On the morning of the 3rd day, a commotion in the narrow street below woke her. She pulled aside the ragged curtain to see a carriage that brought the entire neighborhood to a standstill. It was not merely a wealthy nobleman's carriage. It was painted in the brilliant, unmistakable gold and crimson of the royal household. The crest of the British monarchy was emblazoned on the doors. 4 magnificent white horses stomped impatiently in the mud. Before Genevieve could fully comprehend what she was seeing, heavy boots sounded on the wooden stairs of the boarding house. Her door was pushed open by the terrified landlady, who immediately dropped into a deep curtsy and practically crawled out of the way. Into the tiny, damp room stepped 2 royal guards in scarlet tunics, followed by an older gentleman in immaculate court dress. Genevieve recognized him instantly. It was Lord William Cavendish, the king's most trusted private secretary. "Lady Genevieve Sinclair?" Lord Cavendish asked, his voice gentle but commanding. He deliberately used her maiden name. "I am she," Genevieve replied, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, acutely aware of the miserable state of her lodgings. "You are requested at St. James's Palace immediately, my lady, by order of the Crown." Genevieve's heart hammered in her chest. Had Arthur already gone to the Crown to enforce his cruelty? Was she to be banished from the city entirely? "Requested by whom, Lord Cavendish? The Prince Regent?" Cavendish's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No, my lady. The Prince Regent is at Brighton. You are summoned by His Majesty the King himself." Genevieve gasped. King George III was famously reclusive, suffering from bouts of severe mental illness that kept him hidden away from the public eye. The Prince Regent ruled in his stead. For the actual king to summon a disgraced, freshly divorced noblewoman was unheard of. It was impossible. "Please, my lady, there is no time to explain, and His Majesty's lucid moments are precious and unpredictable. We must go." 30 minutes later, Genevieve was sweeping through the opulent, hushed corridors of St. James's Palace. The air smelled of beeswax and old roses. She felt entirely out of place in her damp, plain gown, but the guards paid her no mind, escorting her deep into the private, heavily guarded royal apartments. Lord Cavendish led her to a set of heavy mahogany doors, knocked twice, and opened them. "Lady Genevieve Sinclair, Your Majesty." The room was bathed in the warm, golden light of dozens of candelabras. It was a private study, overflowing with maps, ancient texts, and astronomical globes. Seated in a high-backed velvet chair by the fire was King George. He looked frail, his white hair wild, but as he turned to look at her, his pale blue eyes were shockingly sharp, clear, and perfectly sane. "Leave us, Cavendish," the king ordered. his voice raspy but carrying the undeniable authority of a monarch. The door clicked shut, leaving Genevieve alone with the King of England. She immediately sank into a deep, sweeping curtsy, her knees trembling. "Rise, child," King George said, motioning to a chair opposite him. "Come closer to the fire. You look half frozen." Genevieve sat tentatively on the edge of the chair. "Your Majesty, I am deeply honored, though I confess I do not know why I am here." The king let out a long, heavy sigh, reaching out to a small, intricately carved wooden box resting on a table beside him. "I hear your husband has cast you aside, Lady Genevieve. I hear the Duke of Westmorland laughed as you signed the papers, separating your names forever." Genevieve flushed with shame, looking down at her hands. "Word travels quickly to the palace, Your Majesty. Yes, Arthur has annulled our marriage. I am no longer a duchess." A strange, triumphant smile touched the old king's lips. "Good. That arrogant, insufferable boy has finally made the mistake I have been waiting 50 years for his wretched family to make." Genevieve's head snapped up in confusion. "Your Majesty?" King George opened the carved box. Inside lay a stack of incredibly old, fragile vellum documents, sealed with the heavy wax crests of monarchs long dead. He carefully lifted the top document, the parchment crackling in the quiet room. "The Hallowell family," the king began, his tone dripping with centuries-old royal disdain. "Ah, thieves, Lady Genevieve." Arthur's grandfather, the first Duke of Westmorland, did not earn his title through valor or loyalty. He earned it through blackmail. Genevieve held her breath, entirely captivated by the king's words. "During the Jacobite rebellion," the king continued, "the first duke intercepted letters between my grandfather, King George II, and certain Scottish lords. Letters that, if made public, would have fractured the crown's alliances and caused a civil war. To buy the Hallowell silence, my grandfather was forced to grant them the Duchy of Westmorland, along with thousands of acres of prime land, the coal mines, and the ports." I do not understand, Your Majesty. How does this involve me?" Genevieve asked, her mind spinning. The king leaned forward, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Because, Genevieve, that land did not belong to the crown to give away. It was stolen territory. Centuries prior, by a sovereign decree of King James I, the entirety of those lands, the very earth upon which the Westmorland wealth is built, was granted in perpetuity to the Earls of Sinclair, your ancestors." Genevieve felt the room tilt. "My ancestors?" "Yes," the king said, tapping the ancient parchment. "My grandfather illegally stripped the Sinclairs of their hidden royal charter to pay off the Hallowell blackmailers, but he left a secret clause in the royal archives, a fail-safe. He decreed that should a Sinclair ever wed a Hallowell, the stolen titles and lands would legally merge, legitimizing the Hallowell claim once and for all." The pieces of the puzzle crashed together in Genevieve's mind with deafening clarity. That is why Arthur married me. My father's debts, the sudden interest from a duke. He didn't want me. He was secretly securing his family's stolen empire. "Precisely." The king nodded, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, vindictive light. "Arthur's lawyers discovered the secret decree in the archives 3 years ago. He married you solely to legally bind the Sinclair bloodline to his stolen lands, ensuring the crown could never reclaim them. You were the keystone holding his entire empire together." "But he just divorced me," Genevieve whispered, the realization washing over her like a tidal wave. "He annulled the marriage. He erased it as if it never happened." King George let out a rich, booming laugh that sounded incredibly youthful for a man of his age. It was a joyous, righteous sound, a stark contrast to the cruel laughter Arthur had weaponized in the library. "He erased it," the king confirmed, smiling broadly. Driven by his arrogance and his lust for that Linley woman, Arthur Hallowell severed the very tie that protected him. By annulling the marriage, he has declared the Sinclair merger legally void, which means the king picked up the heavy royal seal, pressing it firmly into a pool of hot red wax on a fresh piece of parchment. He handed the document across the table to Genevieve, which means, Lady Genevieve, the Hallowell family no longer owns the Westmorland estate. They do not own the mines. They do not own the ships in the harbor. By right of original charter, newly restored by the crown, King George paused, his eyes crinkling with profound satisfaction. It all belongs to you. For 6 weeks, Genevieve did not exist in the eyes of London society. To the gossiping lords and ladies of the Times Ton, the former Duchess of Westmorland had vanished, presumably having slunk back to the freezing moors of Scotland in well-deserved disgrace. In reality, she was living in a heavily guarded, opulent suite within St. James's Palace, a guest of the king himself. Those 6 weeks were a blur of strategy, ledgers, and royal law. Under the meticulous guidance of Lord Cavendish and the formidable Lord Chancellor, John Scott, Lord Eldon, the highest-ranking judge in England, Genevieve learned the staggering breadth of the empire she now owned. The Westmorland wealth was not just a fortune. It was a cornerstone of the British economy. The coal mines in Newcastle, the sprawling agricultural estates in Sussex, the massive fleet of merchant ships docked in the Thames, all of it legally belonged to the Sinclair name, secured by the ancient decree of King James I and triggered by Arthur's own arrogant hand. "He was so desperate to be rid of you, my lady," Lord Eldon remarked one evening, adjusting his heavy spectacles as he pored over the annulment papers Arthur's solicitors had filed. He demanded an absolute dissolution from the very date of the wedding. In doing so, he legally erased the only bridge connecting his family's stolen title to the royal charter. The moment the ecclesiastical court stamped this document, Arthur Hallowell rendered himself a trespasser in his own home. Genevieve traced the edge of the king's royal seal with a gloved finger. "When do we tell him?" Lord Cavendish smiled, a sharp aristocratic curving of the lips. "The Duke is hosting a grand winter ball on the 20th of December to announce his impending marriage to Lady Beatrice Linley. The entirety of the House of Lords will be in attendance. I can think of no better stage to correct the historical record, can you?" The night of December 20th brought a fresh, biting snow to Mayfair. The Westmorland townhouse blazed with light, its towering windows casting golden rectangles onto the white streets. Carriages lined up for half a mile, discharging dukes, earls, and politicians dressed in velvet and diamonds. Inside, the grand ballroom was a masterpiece of winter flora, festooned with holly, ivy, and thousands of imported white roses. An orchestra played a lively waltz, and champagne flowed like a river. Standing on the grand staircase, looking down at the sea of aristocrats, Arthur Hallowell felt entirely invincible. He wore a masterfully tailored jacket of midnight blue, a diamond pin winking at his cravat. On his arm was Beatrice, looking radiant and smug, her pregnancy barely showing beneath an empire waist gown of spun silver. Around her neck sat the legendary Westmorland diamonds, a heavy, breathtaking collar of flawless stones that had belonged to the Duchesses of Westmorland for a century. "Look at them," Arthur murmured, kissing Beatrice's temple. "They all know I cast my wife into the gutters, and yet they drink my wine and bow to you. Money is the only true god in this country, Beatrice, and you, my darling, are its high priest," she purred, tracing his jawline. "When will you make the announcement?" "Before supper," Arthur replied. "I want to see the envy in their eyes when I name you the new Duchess." As the clock struck 11, Arthur signaled the orchestra to stop. The music faded into a discordant scrape of bows, and the murmuring crowd turned their attention to the grand staircase. Arthur puffed out his chest, stepping forward to the landing. "My lords, ladies, esteemed friends," Arthur's voice boomed over the crowd, dripping with self-satisfaction. "I welcome you to my home. Tonight is a night of celebration. As you all know, I have recently freed myself from a burdensome, empty arrangement. I stand before you, a man renewed, and I am thrilled to announce my upcoming nuptials to the beautiful." The massive double oak doors of the ballroom did not just open. They were thrown wide with a violent, booming crash that made the closest lords jump backward in alarm. Standing in the threshold were 4 royal foot guards, resplendent in their scarlet coats and tall bearskin caps, their muskets gleaming under the chandeliers. The crowd gasped, parting like the Red Sea. In London society, the arrival of the Royal Guard meant only one thing: treason. Arthur's smile vanished. "What is the meaning of this? Who dares interrupt my house?" From between the ranks of the imposing guards stepped Lord Chancellor Eldon, dressed in his full judicial robes of black silk and gold lace, looking every inch the terrifying embodiment of British law. "This is no longer your house, Mr. Hallowell," Lord Eldon's voice rang out, cold and clear, deliberately stripping Arthur of his ducal title. Arthur's face flushed dark red. "Mr. Hallowell? Have you lost your senses, Eldon? I am the Duke of Westmorland. I demand to know who sent you." "I did." The voice was female, smooth, and laced with absolute authority. From the shadows of the antechamber, Lady Genevieve Sinclair stepped into the light. A collective, breathless shock ripped through the ballroom. The gossips had claimed she was dead of a fever, or rotting in a debtor's prison. Yet here she stood, looking more magnificent than she ever had during her 3 years as Arthur's wife. She was dressed not in mourning, but in a gown of deep, regal crimson velvet, heavily embroidered with the silver stag of the Sinclair crest. Her dark hair was swept up into a crown of braids, interwoven with pearls. But it was her eyes that held the room captive. They were fierce, unyielding, and utterly devoid of fear. "Genevieve," Arthur breathed, gripping the marble banister. He quickly recovered, his shock curdling into rage. "You dare return here? Guards, remove this trespassing vagrant from my property immediately." The royal guards did not flinch. They remained rigidly at attention, flanking Genevieve. Lord Eldon unrolled a heavy, wax-sealed vellum scroll. "There is only one trespasser in this hall, Mr. Hallowell, and it is you." Beatrice clutched Arthur's arm, her face paling. "Arthur, what is he talking about? Make them leave." "By the direct decree of His Majesty, King George III, Lord Eldon announced, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the silent ballroom. "And validated by the High Court of Chancery, it is hereby declared that the titles, lands, estates, and all financial holdings associated with the Duchy of Westmorland were unlawfully seized from the Crown in the year 1745. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Arthur looked genuinely bewildered. "Unlawfully seized? My grandfather was granted this land by the king." "Your grandfather blackmailed the king," Genevieve spoke, her voice slicing through the whispers. She slowly ascended the first few steps of the grand staircase, forcing Arthur to look down at the woman he had discarded. He stole the lands. Lands that, by prior royal charter, belonged entirely and in perpetuity to the Earls of Sinclair. Arthur let out a harsh, barking laugh, though his eyes darted nervously to the royal guards. "This is madness!" A desperate ploy from a ruined woman. "Even if this absurd fairy tale were true, I married you. The Sinclair bloodline was bound to mine." "Yes, it was," Genevieve said softly, a deadly smile touching her lips. "And you spent 3 years searching for a way to break that bond. I begged you not to annul the marriage, Arthur. I warned you it would bring ruin, but you laughed." Arthur's breath hitched. The blood rapidly drained from his face as the trap finally snapped shut around his mind. By filing for a total annulment, Lord Eldon interjected, holding up a copy of the very paper Arthur had forced Genevieve to sign. "You successfully argued before the church that your union to Lady Genevieve never legally existed. You severed the bloodline. Therefore, the Sinclair properties, including the very floorboards beneath your boots, revert instantly to their rightful owner. King George has signed the restorative decree." The ballroom erupted into sheer pandemonium. Women gasped behind their fans. Men shouted in disbelief. "No!" Arthur roared, releasing Beatrice and lunging down the stairs toward Genevieve. "It's a lie! I own the docks! I own the bank accounts! Abernathy! Where is Abernathy?" His rat-faced solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, who had been enjoying the champagne near the orchestra, was currently pressing himself against the wall, looking as though he might faint. He realized with sheer horror that he had personally drafted the legal instrument of his client's total destruction. "The accounts at Baring Brothers have been frozen by the Crown," Lord Eldon stated ruthlessly. "The deeds to the ships have been transferred. You are entirely destitute, Mr. Hallowell. You possess nothing but the clothes upon your back." Genevieve reached the landing, stopping just a step below Arthur. She looked at the man who had tormented her, who had treated her as breeding stock, who had cast her into the freezing rain with nothing but a valise. "The necklace, Beatrice," Genevieve said, turning her dark eyes to the trembling mistress. Beatrice let out a high-pitched sob, her hands flying to her throat to protect the diamonds. "No, Arthur gave them to me." "Arthur gave you stolen property," Genevieve corrected coldly. "Take it off, or I will have the King's Guard strip it from your neck in front of the entire peerage." Shaking violently, tears streaming down her carefully powdered face, Beatrice fumbled with the heavy gold clasp. It gave way, and the magnificent diamonds pooled into her hands. A royal guard stepped forward, took the jewels from the sobbing woman, and presented them to Genevieve. Genevieve did not put them on. She merely handed them to Lord Cavendish. "Have them cleaned," she said dismissively. Arthur fell to his knees on the marble stairs. The arrogant, untouchable Duke of Westmorland was gone, replaced by a broken, hyperventilating man. "Genevieve, please, you cannot do this. You know I have debts. My gambling markers. If I cannot pay them, they will throw me in Fleet Prison. I will die there." Genevieve looked down at him, her expression a mask of beautiful, untouchable ice. "You should have thought of the rain, Arthur, before you locked the door." The eviction of Arthur Hallowell was the most spectacular scandal London had witnessed in a century. The very next morning, the grand mahogany doors of the Mayfair townhouse were thrown open once again, this time by Genevieve's newly appointed bailiffs. Arthur was dragged from the premises, screaming obscenities and threatening lawsuits he had no money to fund. True to Genevieve's poetic justice, Arthur was permitted to leave with exactly what she had been given, a single, battered valise. He sought refuge with Beatrice, assuming the mother of his future child would stand by him, but Beatrice Linley was a creature of survival and luxury. When Arthur arrived at the small, discreet townhouse he had previously rented for her, he found her trunks already loaded onto a carriage. "Beatrice!" Arthur cried, running to the carriage door as she settled inside. "Where are you going? We must pool what little funds you have. I know a solicitor who can challenge the Crown's decree." Beatrice looked at him through the glass window, her beautiful face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. "Challenge the king? You are a fool, Arthur. I am going to the country with Viscount Stirling. He is 70, nearly blind, but his bank accounts are firmly his own." "But the child!" Arthur screamed, gripping the carriage door. "My heir!" Beatrice let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "Your heir? Oh, Arthur. You truly are arrogant to the very end. You could never give Genevieve a child. What made you think you gave one to me?" Arthur recoiled as if struck by lightning, his hands dropping from the carriage. The child was not his. The final pillar of his ego shattered into dust. The carriage lurched forward, leaving Arthur Hallowell standing alone in the muddy streets of London, entirely bankrupt, utterly humiliated, and completely alone. Within a fortnight, his creditors caught up with him. The man who had once bought aristocrats was dragged off to the squalid, disease-ridden cells of Fleet Debtors' Prison, where he would spend the rest of his miserable life begging for scraps. Back in Mayfair, the Westmorland townhouse underwent a transformation. The heavy, oppressive shadows of Arthur's reign were swept away. Genevieve did not take the title of Duchess. That was a tainted, false name. Instead, by royal decree, she was officially recognized as the Countess of Sinclair in her own right. She was no longer an appendage to a man. She was a sovereign lord of industry. She reinstated every servant Arthur had fired, doubling their wages. She took over the mahogany desk in the Grand Library, dismissing Abernathy and Fitzroy, and hiring young, brilliant minds from the middle class to help run her empire. Where Arthur had ruled through fear and exploitation, Genevieve ruled with sharp intellect and fierce protection of her people. She invested heavily in the safety of her coal mines, earning the undying loyalty of thousands of workers in the north. She expanded her shipping fleet, negotiating directly with foreign merchants who were initially shocked, and then deeply intimidated by the ruthless business acumen of the beautiful Countess. One crisp spring afternoon, over a year after the night of the winter ball, Genevieve stood in the library of her London home. The windows were open, letting in the scent of blooming jasmine from the gardens below. She was reviewing the quarterly ledgers for her Sussex estates with Lord Thomas Harrington, the dashing, fiercely intelligent nephew of Lord Cavendish. Thomas was a naval captain who had recently retired, and the only man in London who looked at Genevieve not as a fortune to be won, but as an equal to be respected. "Your yields are up 20%, Genevieve," Thomas said, leaning against the edge of the mahogany desk, his warm brown eyes crinkling with admiration. "At this rate, you could buy half of Scotland back by Christmas." Genevieve smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that never would have graced her face during her marriage to Arthur. She dipped her quill into the inkwell, her signature flowing across the bottom of the ledger with elegant, commanding strokes. "Genevieve Sinclair." "I do not need to buy Scotland, Thomas," she replied softly, setting the quill down and looking out the grand window. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the world outside belonged to her. "I already own everything I could ever want." She had walked into the freezing rain as a discarded, ruined woman. She had returned as a queen, and the Sinclair name, nearly extinguished by a cruel man's greed, would shine brightly in the annals of history for 1,000 years to come. If you were captivated by Genevieve's epic revenge and her rise to power, make sure to like this video. Share it with your friends who love a true historical drama where the villain gets exactly what they deserve. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a thrilling tale of romance, betrayal, and royal secrets. What was your favorite twist? Let us know in the comments below.